So we've got a stellar panel. I'm going to stand up. We've got a stellar panel with representation from health sciences, environmental sciences to talk about world-changing transformation. So big round of applause before we dive in with introductions. So thanks so much. Thanks for your time. We've got Diane Wu, co-founder and CEO of Trace Genomics, Maria Soloveichik, founder and CEO, Synthex, Olia Erzak, founder and CEO, Frost Methane Labs. Before we get into the moderated questions, can I ask, who here in the audience aspires to be a CEO? Get a show of hands. Awesome. So clearly this is going to be relevant for you. And for those of you who don't aspire to be a CEO, me, it's still important because I'd love to hear what they have to say, their advice. So just to set some broad context, if each of you can just provide a little bit of background on your companies and your inspiration for it.
Great, I guess I'll start. So broadly, the problem that we're trying to solve is that the world population is projected to be 10 billion people by 2050. And so to match that kind of growth, we're going to have to produce 70% more food. And that's a struggle that the entire agricultural industry is facing. Every year, we still lose over $200 billion due to diseases, plant diseases, that cause a number of catastrophes, well documented in history, Irish potato famine, a number of rice diseases that have plagued India and China. And so in trying to solve this problem, there's also a consumer movement now towards organic, sustainable farming, local farming, and really promoting soil health. And when you step onto a farm and you talk to a farmer, you realize they make a lot of decisions purely based on guesswork, based on what happened last season, what's happening to their neighbor. They smell the soil to try to guess what's going on. And every seed comes out of the ground and really forms symbiotic relationships with the many millions of microbes that are in the soil, and those microbes can lead to diseases or they can make nutrients more available for the plant. And so when we realized how important the soil was for these farmers and how they had no access to the information on that soil, we decided to release what some people like to call a 23andMe kit for soil, which is to make the microbial sequencing technology available to every farmer in the world. No matter if you're a small or a large farmer, you don't have to be a Monsanto to have access to this technology. And to give people the data on the most critical capital investment on their farm and give them that insight into how they can make the best decisions to not only make money at the end of one season, but to preserve the long-term sustainability of their farm. Briefly, my background, I did my undergraduate in computer science. My PhD was in genetics, looking at microbiomes. And then I worked at Palantir for a couple of years as a data scientist. My grandfather was a farmer, and I never really remembered that passion of growing up on his farm and how much pride he held when he put his produce on the table until I started talking to the farmers here in the valley. And so that's what spawned the whole company, which I started with my co-founder who I met in graduate school.
Great, thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak here. It's awesome. So my company, Synthex, is aiming to use synthetic biology as a tool for accelerating drug discovery. Drug discovery has been around for quite a while. People are starting to better understand the mechanisms of why certain drugs work, and the bar has actually gotten a lot higher for proving that a drug works in a way that we can predict, for patients that we can predict, and in a way that we understand potential mechanisms for escape. We are particularly interested in treating oncology, which still remains a major killer. It's indiscriminate in who it targets from birth, from childhood. It's the major killer of old age, actually, still. And a lot of progress has been made, and currently there's a lot of cancers that are considered almost curable, but the vast majority isn't. What we've done is we are using synthetic biology as a way to be able to accelerate how we find these new types of drugs. My company essentially started from the idea of, can we exploit organisms as little manufacturing factories and also as a system to give us a readout at the same time. So what we engineered cells to do is not only make diverse types of compounds, but also tell us whether or not they're working, which limits the amount of labor that has to be done by the scientists on the R&D side, and be able to accelerate a process that typically takes 3 to 5 years into a matter of a couple of years. Yeah, we started about 3 years ago in the company. I moved from Toronto to San Francisco. Toronto is where I did my PhD in epigenetics and cancer metabolism. And the company, we got our foot in the door through an accelerator called IndieBio, and we have been here since.
Hi, my name is Olia, and I work on climate change mitigation. We focus on a greenhouse gas called methane. So I know everybody knows about CO2. Methane is responsible for about 20% of the warming that we experience today. And what we do is we find very concentrated areas of methane release, typically geological in nature rather than human-made. And we just find very large ones through satellite imagery analysis and then go out to the site, install devices on site to be able to mitigate that. We typically work in a region called the permafrost, which has a very terrifying amount of greenhouse gases, typically in the north of the northern hemisphere. And how we got here, so I also have a computer science background, and I'm also from Toronto. Basically worked at the intersection of technology and climate change for the past 9 years, first on electric grids, and then kind of residential optimization, and eventually on these a little bit more obscure climate change problems where there's actually not very much development happening as opposed to the electric grid, which now has actually a very healthy ecosystem.
Great, so Diane, I'll start with you. So this is the 5th anniversary of the Women in Tech Festival. And I'll start with you because you're the most tenured CEO here, 4 years, Trace Genomics. What has changed for you in the past 4 to 5 years, and where do you think the industry technology is going in the next 5 years?
I must have so much more wisdom in that one extra year, Maria. I was listening to Kai's talk earlier, and one thing she said really struck me, which was women need to show off more. And that really strikes me because I am scared of showing off. I'm scared of taking credit and being too braggy, and that's been a growth curve for me. And what I noticed similarly in the movement for women to grow into STEM, to move into leadership positions, it's really about taking that chance, leaning in, and showing off and believing in yourself so that you can then pull others up. And in the last, not just in my startup, but in my previous positions, I've had so many women leaders who told me to sit at the table because I was sitting in the back, and so many men too who pulled me up. And what I've noticed in the industry is there's a lot of more of that. There's a lot of, as Kai also mentioned, there's a lot of statistics that are disheartening, but there's huge amounts of changes. Last year, I think I saw the stat, Stanford CS now has more women than men enrolling in the degree, and that's, incredible progress.
Yeah, impressive. Wow, that's really amazing. And I think just people are coming out more with the messaging, right? We're inspired by Michelle Obama becoming Melinda Gates, moment of lift. So the messaging's definitely out there, so I see us accelerating. Olia, from computer science, software development, engineering, nuclear fusion, to reducing greenhouse gases. Wow. Just walk us through that journey. You've worked for some great companies, so walk us through how you've gotten to where you are.
Sure. So I think there was a pivotal point that happened actually in my master's. So I do have a computer science background, and about a year before I graduated, I read a 4-page article in Scientific American that talked about ocean acidification. So I was living in Canada. At the time, they called it global warming. When you live in Canada, anything that ends in warming sounds great. So I wasn't particularly concerned. And it was this article that showed that there's these really global effects with potential mass extinction effects that really propelled me basically from that day. I was like, hey, I don't think I can work in anything that's not climate change. Now, lucky enough, there's a very serious intersection between software engineering and climate change. And so my first professional job was at Google Energy, which at the time was under google.org, which, by the way, had, I think, a 50-50 gender ratio, maybe even heavier on women at the time. I think now it's even heavier women, but less engineering. So that, worked there as a software engineer, became a tech lead, went to Google X to work on early stage companies, also specifically climate change. So one spun out as Dandelion with an amazing female CEO, one spun out as Malta, also with an amazing female CEO. And then went to work on, to a startup to work on mini grids in sub-Saharan Africa. So all kind of climate change related things, but very different kind of ends of the spectrum from very rich developed world, lots of resources to there's people without electricity, but that are cutting down a lot of forests for it. And from that, once I saw an opportunity in the permafrost, which is something that most people that work in climate change have nightmares about because of the potential negative consequences. Once I saw an opportunity that had a self-sustaining business model to really mitigate the lowest hanging fruit there, I just kind of had to start the company. So we ran it as a side project with a couple of friends for a little bit, got enough proof point, and then was ready to quit the job and really start doing this full time.
Great.
Oh, sorry, the nuclear fusion part.
Yes.
That is, so I was advising the only venture capital fund called Strong Atomics that invests in nuclear fusion startups because that's an area that's very underinvested and potentially could be very large for climate change. So I was an advisor on the energy side. Like, if it works, does it have a market in the current kind of electric grid? So that's what I would advise on, not the nuclear physics. There were other advisors for that.
Maria, what effect has Synthex had on healthcare in terms of discovering new drugs? I'm seeing a lot of different applications of your technology and treatment of cancer and disease. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, what we're doing is actually pretty complementary to what chemists have been trying to do for a while. So they've gotten really good at chemically making broad diversities of compounds. And by genetically encoding them, we can actually increase the diversity quite a bit. So for example, a chemical library is like 1 million compounds on a really good day. Genetically, we can encode up to 10 billion compounds. So that really opens up how many we can screen agnostically and how quickly we can go through them. So for us, a screen is essentially you grow up like a couple of liters of bugs and you plate them, and the ones that survive are the ones that make a drug that potentially works. For chemists, they make these libraries and then they get screened by teams of like 20, 30 people for months at a time, looking at like enzymatic readouts, which are pretty expensive and painful. And actually just yesterday I was presenting at a biotech, as an actual therapeutics conference that was talking about a lot of the chemical approaches that people have been developing to this day. And then when I mentioned what we were doing, actually there's a lot of interest that was generated, which was very encouraging to see. So people are starting to think about how can we use nature to do things for us, as opposed to how we've always been doing it. And that's actually become a really good spot to get into it, because with DNA sequencing, there's so many organisms that we're discovering, and a lot of compounds out there are derived from natural sources, right? Like, even your Lipitor, or a lot of your compounds are starting as natural compounds, like artemisinin, right? It was from a plant. And the plant wouldn't really grow, and it's being used in the treatment of malaria. And the Nobel Prize actually went to the guy who figured out how to be able to make artemisinin artificially using the genes that the plant actually uses. So a lot of progress has been made on understanding how genetic plays a part in creating molecules that are beneficial to humanity. And we are trying to harness that ability and scale it up to be able to treat a bunch of different types of diseases.
Great, thank you so much. So this is a women's conference. Would love to hear from, I'm just gonna open it up to the panel on what we can do to advance women in technology, and also as leaders, do you have any specific diversity and inclusion measures at your companies?
Well, I think I alluded to one. I think I'm a big believer that every incredible woman behind every incredible woman leader is at least 20 supporters of women leaders. And they are not gender discriminant. We have many, many men who have opened doors for us, who have daughters who want to see a different world and a different set of opportunities for their daughters, and women who similarly support each other. So I think support is a big thing, and I think there's a lot more funding and mentors who are moving into that. In terms of diversity, I think I'm a big believer in inclusion over diversity, meaning that it's not just about gender. That isn't the only thing that biases and divides the room. is obviously racial and ethical background, it's it's social background, it's opinions in the room, it's the monoculture that ostracizes women, it's the idea that, you know, you have to be our friend. No, it's about respect for your coworkers, not about, you know, playing basketball after work. And so that's the kind of culture that we foster, and when you do that, we find that diversity just kind of falls in place, and the numbers just kind of shake out.
Yeah, I would completely agree. We haven't had any official inclusion criteria or anything, but right now we have 8 people working full-time at the company. Each one is from a different country. Only one is not an immigrant, our token American. We are 50-50 gender split. Completely, like we weren't looking for like, you know, a guy biochemist. We just happened to find, you know, somebody who was a good biochemist that happened to be a guy. Or like a really great cell biologist who was a woman. So I think if you don't put these boundaries in front of you, you end up with a 50-50 split kind of naturally. So it's just been really important to represent what we feel when we're interviewing and not have any preconceived notions of what we look for. Like not thinking like, oh, this is not what a biochemist looks like, but actually looking at what have you done. Yeah, it's really nice to be in a position of power where you can affect change. And when you can actually recruit people that work well together, that respect each other, not because they want to be buddies and hang out after work, but because they genuinely appreciate what each other person contributes to the company.
I don't think I have much to add to these really excellent points, but I do have one anecdote from earlier in the pipeline. So when I was a software engineer at Google, I got to do this really fun thing, which is twice a year, you go back to your university and you help with recruiting and you run workshops. And so I ran workshops for women in computer science. And the one that like I got by far the most engagement on ever, and then replicated it several times, was I told people to think about like a problem that they cared about or a field that they really loved or something like that. And then think about how technology can make that better, right? And like end up kind of with the pitches. But to me, that bit of framing technology, or much earlier in the pipeline, I would probably do it in middle school if I could, but framing technology as something that can make the thing you love better and the things you really don't like about the world a little bit less bad. I thought that the level of engagements I got on that were like off the charts. So for earlier in the pipeline, that framing rather than the framing of like gadgets might be a useful one.
Great. And then just coming back to your companies, would love to hear any specific anecdotes on successes or failures that you think that the audience could learn from.
So many of both. I mean, I think when Maria was saying something earlier about, or Olia, about how you just had to start the company, and I think that kind of passion and belief that if you don't do it, no one else can, is the kind of mentality you need to have, because startups are hard, and that like I've thought things would fail so many times, and you just keep pushing because I really want to see this thing happen. Whereas I've seen other entrepreneurs where they're just searching for ideas, it's really easy just to get disheartened every time there's a failure. So I think that's a big part.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think when I was younger, before I was starting this, every time I had an idea, I figured, oh, there must be somebody else doing this. Or, oh, there's got to be like at least 10 companies working on this one, you know, target for oncology or whatnot. And then you start looking into it, and it's actually remarkable how small the circle of people who can make a difference and who want to make a difference is. So I would not be discouraged by your own discouragement. I would let the world discourage you before. But no, I'm kidding. Like, it's actually a really supportive environment out there for people who genuinely care about making a difference. There are plenty of resources available of like-minded people who would help you up to do that, because it's amazing how few people are in a position to actually affect change. And people want to support that, especially if they have a unique vision, a unique approach, something that hasn't been done before, that they're in a position to do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And definitely have like a support network, because it is hard, right? And you've got those moments where you're like juggling 20 balls at the same time, and you're going to drop some, right? And you know, you make sure to drop the bouncy ones rather than the crystal ones. And you know, you're going to mess up, right? And having that support network that like puts things into perspective, which you're like, oh, you know, I did this thing wrong. And they're like, oh, wait, but remember, you've done this much on a tiny budget with a tiny team super fast, right? Like you need those people that put things in perspective for you. And the other thing I think, just to build like even more on both of those points, is not to be afraid to like ask for help, like anything, right? Like great lawyer recommendations, or like any of the like little things. Like people really do want to help, especially for these like mission-driven businesses, and that's been especially, you know, I'm quite a bit earlier, but in the very early bits, it's invaluable.
I just want to add one more thing, specifically around women. Like, the support network you just mentioned is so important, because for every person who supports you, there's tons of people who tell you that you can't, that, you know, they share stories and it's horrifying. And when you have that support network, you can shove them aside and say, you don't matter. I have my support network and they believe in me, and I just need those people. And it's really, I think, the mentality of focusing on your successes and not your failures, focusing on what you do have going for you and not all the statistics, is really important if you're going to push through.
Maria, you mentioned resources, and I think it'd be helpful for me and also the audience if each of you can talk about a specific resource that has been a game changer for you or very inspirational that helps you be effective.
Yeah, I mean,
A book, a leader you follow, a podcast.
it's actually, I've never found it to be a single source. I feel like the more input you get, the better your output will be.
Sure.
So I don't really have a favorite book I can recommend or a single podcast. It's just kind of been everything, which is why you open yourself up to as much as you can. And then you filter through the noise to what makes sense to your specific case. I mean, no two things are alike. Every time I read a biography, it's incredible how many things lined up for that one person that will never line up for, in my case, right?
Yeah.
A lot of it is revisionist history that isn't really relevant. So I try not to put too much stock into that, because then you just constantly feel guilty that you're not performing up to what somebody else has. Everybody's got their own path. I find that the thing that has been most helpful for me is to open myself up to opportunities and be better at being, not extroverted, but being out there. I mean, I'm a scientist. My instinct is to like hide away behind the food table somewhere at a conference. It's not to be talking to people. So it's been an internal battle of getting myself out of my shell to do that, to become available, to become a resource for other people. There's actually a lot of responsibility that I feel to other founders starting up and trying to help them as much as I can, because I've gotten my, you know, my lucky break and I've managed to get into the ecosystem through some like magic. So now I'm in a position when I can help people, and I try to do that as much as I can and become a resource for others.
I don't want to describe the book because I don't think I can do a good job, but there's this body of work called Conscious Leadership Group, and I'm part of a forum where we meet once a month and chat on Slack and so forth. And it's transformed the way I lead, how I live my life. It's based on a book called The 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership. So if you want to read it.
I also don't have like a specific one, just because you end up doing so many different things, so you kind of find different people and different resources for things. There are two things that stick out for me though. One is Scientific American, right? Or any of these, let's call it news, that is positive and solution oriented, has been pretty instrumental for me before the startup, quite a bit before the startup, probably like grad school, to shape a particular kind of mindset, right, and to be kind of brought across fields. And another one is something that one of our funders like basically makes everybody read. Is called Switch. So how to change people's behavior, how to change things in an organization. I have not used it, but very fascinating.
Great. So you guys are the future. You have thought of the future in technology. What do you think is going to be the most interesting new development in technology, or what innovation is or should be on the horizon that we're not thinking of, that you'd love to see? Flying cars.
Oh man. I have a slightly strange answer to that, because I'm in climate change, so you know that's always. But I think for us, one of the things, there's kind of two ways, and you can see this, let's say, with solar panels, right? There's, in some cases, you like put a bunch of money, you dream up the thing, and it becomes incredibly expensive, right? And then somebody like there's a policy shift somewhere that then says, okay, now the entire country is going to subsidize solar panels, and that's when they really, really, really come down in price and end up kind of making that difference. So from the climate change standpoint, there are so many technologies that are out there that are really, really close to being competitive, and they just need the scale-up market, right? There's washing machines that are 6 times more efficient, right? Like on the market today, not that much more expensive. And so there's like so much stuff that is already there that is just waiting to just like have those manufacturing tweaks, and I'm actually like unreasonably excited about that. And of course, fusion.
Yeah, I mean, as the geneticist, I guess I'll mention the power of genetics and affecting everything around us, from healthcare, from being able to say that I have a gene that could, have some sort of an effect in a child. If my partner also has a similar allele, to be able to change that in utero is amazing. Preventative medicine, being able to sequence your DNA from birth and see what you're predisposed to, so you can avoid those things in your lifestyle. A lot of things, the biggest change for oncology ever has been, not smoking, right? That campaign alone saved more lives than any drug ever has. So behavioral changes early on based on actual data that you can use. I mean, we all know those cases where like a 90-year-old that smoked their entire life and never got cancer. That's not a good way to live for most people. that 90-year-old is probably an exception. But if you had that information arming you from birth, right? Like your parents could raise you in a way that's most beneficial for you. So that's really powerful.
I'm not sure I have a ton to add, but obviously AI is changing the world very quickly, and CRISPR is going to change the world very quickly, whether you like the effects or not. And I think personally, one technology, really a lot of the social problems that I think we are struggling with, especially around in gender or the pay gap, it falls back into social restraints. And I think I'm really excited about the idea of remote work and mobility, the idea of being able to use technology to support different hours, to support productivity in different locations where you're not having to stick with the existing social structure that doesn't quite today align with promoting diversity in the workplace. So,
Great. One final question before we open it up to the audience, but we've got a lot of future CEOs here. What did you want to share with them? Any thoughts? Anything that they can take away in terms of tactical advice, what you wish you'd known when you were getting started? Yeah.
Let's see, I guess one of the most helpful things is to focus on what you're good at and try to supplement what you aren't. But at the same time, because having gone through a PhD program, the one thing that you learn is how to learn. So not to be shy about learning new things. That has been, I feel, incredibly helpful for me. Is like even learning accounting, right? It's not rocket science. You can, do some YouTube courses, figure out how to put your stuff on QuickBooks. But just knowing how to do all these things early on has been really helpful instead of neglecting them and then having to deal with them later. So dedicating time to doing annoying things they don't necessarily want to do but need to be done eventually to help you. So not punishing your future self is a mentality that I tried getting into early on.
I think there's less of a rule book than you might think, right? I mean, there's U.S. laws, very important, but there's a lot of like social conventions that I feel like, I think some people call it creativity, but I feel like you end up getting around that a lot, right? So there's, I don't know, I can think of like a million cases where, there's a thing that you could pre-sell ahead of time. I think it's kind of a more obvious one. Or there is, some people, the scientific part of your startup makes it a little bit less investable for the for-profit, so you could spit it out as like an accompanying nonprofit. Like there's kind of like all of these weird things that I've seen. I've seen people do public-private partnerships, like, this isn't a business on private money. Hey, the World Bank gives $300 billion every year for this kind of stuff in like one country. So I've seen people do like very creative business models, and we've done some of that, but still definitely learning. And just the rule book compared to a corporate job is just not the same.
Yep.
Absolutely.
I guess just about startups. Startups are about finding value in the world and creating that value that no one else is creating. So a lot of the ideas that will work have never they aren't, being done 100 times. If something's already been done 100 times, it's a different kind of startup. You're like competing with an existing market. But creating value in the world means that you have to see things a little differently from how everyone else sees it. And that means that you have to listen to a lot of different opinions, seek advice, but know that they're just advice. And advice is always distilled from some combination of a unique set of experiences. Don't just take them and follow them. Take different types of advice, sit there, think about it, and synthesize what that means for you. Yeah.
Great. That has been really great insight so far, but we're ready to open it up for questions. If anyone in the audience has a question. Anything?
Did you do such a great job moderating that the whole conversation just got covered?
There's a question up here.
Thank you very much. I'm not very loud, sir. This is really inspirational. What advice would you have for some of us who are still, let's say, an engineer that's part of a larger company, and kind of how do you think about the risk of, we know the statistics of like starting a company, how many companies succeed, what kind of kept you going and inspired you to make that leap? And for those of us who are thinking about the risk side, what advice would you have?
I have two experiences. One is I wanted to start a startup since I was like 20, 22. And I didn't because this is my story. I was discouraged by a lot of the statistics. And one day someone was like, what are you talking about? You have a PhD from Stanford. You have this and that and this and that. And all of these privileged people don't have that. And I sat back and I said, oh my God, you're right. I have so much going for me. And I just discounted so much of it because I was so focused on the things I didn't have and the odds. And odds need to be adjusted based on the new information. The other piece is one of the things that pushed me to make the leap was I went from big company to slightly smaller company, and I kept pushing myself to do the thing that was just scary. It's like scary, I think I'm gonna probably drown, but if I drown, so what? There's another job out there. And putting yourself in those situations where you're forced to swim is how you grow the fastest. And after 2 jumps, I joined a startup that was 10 people, and I was like, I can do this.
Yeah, I mean, I never worked at a big company. I worked in academia, which is a very different setting. I worked at kind of like a slightly more for-profit version of academia, which is also a different setting than a big company. So instead of joining something like Genentech right away after my PhD, I feel that if I hadn't started the company then, I couldn't have started it later, because the comfort of a salary would have probably prevented me, because then my rational thought would be, oh my God, what are you doing? This is, I don't come from a privileged background. My parents are immigrants who live in a rental apartment. I don't have the financial security to say, screw it all, I'm just gonna try to do a company for the fun of it. I definitely wanted the company that I built to be sustainable first. I wanted to convince myself that this could work before starting it. I definitely couldn't take the chance of risking failure. So I wanted to make sure that I had funding secured before. Just a little bit, like $200,000 just to get started from an accelerator was my incentive. Otherwise, I probably would have gotten into a comfortable job and hadn't left until I've, accumulated enough wealth to be comfortable.
So I totally was in a salary job.
Yeah.
Google treats you very nicely. But so I agree that making the shift is really hard. I think, but in other ways, you also have a little bit more saved up, so there is a little bit of of that feeling. So kind of both ways. I think for me, like I'm very driven by a particular kind of like climate change impact, right? And I've tried it in a large company, I've tried it in a smaller company, I started a religion, like I've tried literally everything to make like an impact. And the impact of starting a thing that in a field that there is no one else in, I feel is something that's like even larger than kind of what I had done before. So for me, having seen that opportunity was something that, from even just an impact standpoint, and from honestly being a little bit furious that there isn't enough resources going into climate change just worldwide, when like, well, I can make a dent in this. Like at some point it was this weird thing, and it still is, where it wasn't exactly a choice. So the statistics mattered a little bit less, a lot less.
Great. Yes.
For the what process? Innovation.
This is not an innovation framework, but value creation framework. Always start with the customer, not the technology. Go and talk to your customers. We were lucky. Silicon Valley is actually very close to Monterey and Salinas, which is the salad bowl of the United States. And so, you have to go talk to your customers. And the IDEO framework, the design framework, is really good about kind of need finding. And so that was really helpful.
For us, because we are inventing technology on like a pretty up-to-date basis, it's about staying up to date on what everybody around us is doing, any potential competitors, any blocking IP that exists. So being really up to date on the patents in the field, knowing which companies are kind of in the space, even if they're not necessarily in your space, but how could their stuff potentially be blocking you and how to go around it if you need to, or work with them potentially. So definitely a lot of work just is about maintaining an up-to-date status on everything around you in the scientific literature and in the patent literature, which is not something that a lot of people are used to thinking about.
Yeah, and I think the one other point to add to this is the team, right? There is like a team and a mindset that is kind of creative and encouraging of like different ways of trying things and very open discussion that I feel helps with various kinds of innovation.
Any other questions?
So many. The question was if we had mentors that helped us in this, and my answer was like a very large amount. And that's an incredibly lucky position to be in, but anywhere from people that are spectacular managers that can teach that, people that are investors that have seen a lot of startups and can sort of tell you, like have seen these patterns. Other startup founders that have done this before has been probably like by far the most incredible resource. But yeah, quite a few of those, and it's been incredible.
Yeah, I would agree. I never had any formal mentors that I maintain relationships with, but just people in the ecosystem have been great at fostering my knowledge and helping me learn.
Yeah, same.
Great. Any other questions? Well, please join me in giving a round of applause to our CEOs, the future of technology. Thank you so much.